Hey folks, Marcus again here from the Ashland Fly Shop. We're back on the water today with another episode of Beginning Spey Tactics. And we're out here today. I was out fishing a Scandi setup this morning and it seemed like a good idea to just give you a rundown of Scandi lines, what they are, how we use them, and how they differ from SKAGIT lines. So when I got started in the sport, I fished a SKAGIT line for about a year, and then I got a Scandi line and dry line set up and started to get used to the way that they cast. And I tend to recommend that for people, you know, just spend a good amount of time with a SKAGIT, getting used to the feel and the technique of the cast, getting the motion and the timing down from both sides of your body. And then when you're ready for it and you want to, a Scandi line is a great next step. There are lines that are longer than Scandis out there, but we tend to recommend the Scandi as your next step after the SKAGIT. And the reason for that is they're a little bit longer, but they're still really intuitive to cast. And all those casts that we learn on our SKAGIT lines, like the snap T that I just did, the double spey, those still work on these, 30 to 35 feet Scandi lines. Where the Scandi lines kind of pick up where the SKAGIT lines leaves off is in what we call the airborne casts, like the single spey that I just did. It's the family of casts where the force of the cast is generated by pulling the line through the air as opposed to ripping it off the water. And they're just a super fun family of casts to learn. Really effective and efficient casts for fishing. And when I think about what makes Scandi lines useful in the summertime, at least half of it is the casts that you can do with them. It's just so fun like that to do a single spey with a dry line setup and a muddler like I have on today. That's just such a fun way to fish. Just a really enjoyable series of casts to learn. The other part about it is, in the summertime, we're typically fishing a little bit higher water temperatures than we are in the fall and the winter. And the fish that we have in the river are a little bit more likely to come up in the water column and eat flies that are higher up. So that's when Scandi lines are really applicable, is because that front taper really narrows down compared to a SKAGIT. So they're not going to throw as big of flies, as heavy of flies, or as big of sink tips. But what you get on the other end of that is you get a finer line that turns over more delicately for anything that's oriented towards the surface, which for this time of year, you want a tool that's designed to fish up near the surface, because that's where these fish are moving for flies. Not that the SKAGIT line goes away in the summertime, it certainly has a place, but for me in my fishing, this time of year I feel much more like I gravitate towards the Scandi lines, dry line setups, or throwing like a 10-foot intermediate versaleader on the end of here, or a 3-inch versaleader. So when you make the transition and you buy your first Scandi head for your spey rod, what do you need to think about with these lines compared to SKAGIT? The first thing is weight. If you like the weight on your SKAGIT line, typically you want that Scandi line to be lighter than the SKAGIT that you like on the rod. So today I've got my 12.5-foot 6-weight that I fish a lot in the summertime, and this rod really lights up with a 475 grain SKAGIT. Today, I've got a 420 grain Scandi on there, and that's pretty common to have a Scandi line that's 40 to 60 grains lighter than the SKAGIT that you like on the rod. And the reason for that is, if this line was just as heavy as the SKAGIT, when I pick it up and lift it through the air, it would really bog down the rod. It would start to load the rod deeper down in the blank in midair. But a Scandi line does not work the same way that a SKAGIT does. You know, a SKAGIT loads the rod from being ripped off the water right here and creating that aggressive D-loop load behind you. So when you think about the difference of the two, the SKAGIT is loaded primarily by weight and the Scandi is loaded primarily by speed. It's that line speed of the line moving through the air. It just touches briefly on the water, creates that D-loop really quickly, and then it goes. The other thing to think about is these lines are longer. So we will incorporate a little bit longer stroke in our sweep, and we will pause just a hair more compared to a SKAGIT line. Especially on your waterborne casts like your snap tee, you still will want to use those visual cues. You want to turn your head, make sure you're building a D-loop behind you. And the biggest thing that changes is the Scandi line, because it's longer, is going to take a little bit more time to fill that D-loop space compared to a SKAGIT line. But if you get used to using your eyes as a cue, you can see that you've got that loop and that you're ready to execute your forward cast. One of the uses for the Scandi line is for traditional steelhead flies, and they have some names you'll probably find familiar, like the greenbutt skunk or silver Hilton, and there's modern variations on a lot of this stuff. Basically, they're just small, single hook, you know, size 3 and 5 and 7. Smaller flies, a lot smaller and lighter than the intruders that you may be used to fishing. And when you're throwing these light flies and doing so in a way where you don't want them to sink a bunch, that's when a Scandi line is an awesome presentation. Keeps the flies up near the surface and turns them over gracefully. You know, we're in kind of a low water year around here. Our fish can get a little bit spooky when we get these water conditions. Having a line that lays out more gracefully, puts your fly further away from the end of your line than a SKAGIT setup. It's all something to think about when the fish get a little spooky. And it's another tool in the quiver in your fishing. So when we look at all the different Scandi lines that are out there, we've done a lot of videos on our favorite types of Scandi heads, and it's worth just briefly mentioning. Today I have the Rio Scandi Short on here, which I think of as a very typical, you know, around 30, 35 foot Scandi line that really, you know, it delivers light sink tips very well and dry line setups. Another head worth mentioning is the slightly shorter and more aggressive Rage head from Airflow, which is a very nice casting line as well, and we often recommend that one. There is a shorter series of Scandis called the Spey Light and the Rio Scandi Body, which we use quite a bit. I find that those are usually a little bit more at home with the, you know, a 10 or 12.5 foot sink tip on there compared to these longer ones that really kind of outperform with the floating poly leader or a dry line setup. But it's worth, you know, diving into the types of Scandis, understanding where each of them has their benefit. And when we talk about the benefits of Scandis, what we're talking about is gracefully turning over light sink tips, you know, smaller traditional steelhead flies or hobo spays, that type of thing, and dry flies. So anytime you're wanting to skate a fly, more often than not, a Scandi line is going to be the best way to deliver that fly. Unless you're really pumping out some big wind resistant dries where a SKAGIT and a floating tip does that job better. Most of the dries that I fish skating for steelhead are most effectively done with a Scandi line. The more time you spend in the sport of fly fishing, particularly with spey rods, you'll meet people who have a big preference for one style or the other. You'll meet folks who really love Scandi lines. There's folks that really love long belly lines, traditional spey lines, SKAGIT lines, really short SKAGIT lines. everything that's out there, there's a group of people that loves them. Sometimes there's a tendency to think that any one of those given things is the way to fish. And really, I think being a complete angler is understanding that all of these lines, all of the techniques, all of the lengths of rod, the lengths of lines, they all have a place in your fishing. And getting to understand where that place is, how to use it to your benefit, is really going to help you as an angler to get a deeper understanding of the casting and the sport. So when I think about Scandi lines versus SKAGIT, it's not that one's better than the other or that one's more efficient. It's that Scandi lines help us cover the top end of the water column a little bit more efficiently. They cast dry lines a little bit more gracefully than SKAGIT lines do, and they perform these airborne series of casts like that single spey more efficiently than a SKAGIT line does and more smoothly. So getting to understand those techniques is part of developing your skill set, and I encourage you, if you've been at it with the SKAGIT line, you know, maybe you've hooked a fish or two with a sink tip, or you've spent a year with the SKAGIT line, just get a Scandi. Try a dry line setup, try a fly that's completely unweighted. You might really enjoy the way it feels when a fish, you know, comes 6 feet up out of the water column to eat a muddler that's right near the surface. It's just a really awesome experience. So I hope you learned a little bit about the differences between the Scandi and the SKAGIT and why you might want to use one or the other. If you've been at it for a bit, you've been fishing your SKAGIT setup for a year, you get to this summer steelhead season and you're a little curious about what Scandi is, I hope this helps you out, and I hope it encourages you to pick up a Scandi line and a dry line setup, because they're just so fun. And while the casts can be a little bit intimidating, you know, there was a long time where I couldn't do any of those airborne casts, and I just picked up a Scandi head and I just worked at it. It's not like it took too long to learn them. They are a little bit more sensitive to timing, but they're so fun. And getting to master the single spey, the spiral spey, and the snake roll is just something I feel like every spey angler needs to do. So I hope you pick up a Scandi line this season and give it a go. Thanks for tuning in.